is Dr. Supreet Kaur from University of Delhi. Today we will be continuing our series of tax management in which we were already discussing about the tax elasticity. So talking about this tax elasticity wherein we were discussing about the elasticity of demand and supply, and we talked about how the tax burden which falls onto the most inelastic side of the market, right, and what impact does it create onto the consumers and the suppliers. So we have already discussed that if the demand is more and it is more inelastic than supply, then the consumers will obviously bear the most of the burden of the taxes, and vice versa. If the supply is more inelastic, then your demand, then the sellers will bear the most of the tax burden. So basically we were talking about the elasticity of our taxes, that when demand becomes inelastic, consumers are not very responsive to price changes, and therefore the quantity that is demanded, it remains relatively constant, and especially when a tax is introduced. Similarly, we see the similar cases when we are quoting examples of smoking or cigarettes, right? So demand is basically more inelastic because consumers being addicted to the product, being addicted to type of good. So, the sellers can easily pass on the burden of the taxes to the consumer by pushing in for higher prices, by putting in a greater amount of taxes, because the reason remains the same, that demand for that particular product will remain inelastic. So that is how we have till time discussed about that what has been the impact of the taxes onto the demand and supply, and correspondingly the impact of the taxes onto either the consumers or your suppliers. Now when we talk about this elasticity of our taxes, there are certain other concepts which relates to the same. It also connects with the coverage of the taxes, the time period, administrative compliance costs. So these are the certain factors that we are going to discuss it today. So starting up with the coverage of the taxes. So now let's suppose if any supplier or producer, they impose the taxes on tea, right, and not onto its let's say the substitutes that are easily available, let's suppose the coffee. So then it will be very difficult for the producers that they'll shift the entire taxes onto the tea, and those taxes being passed on to the consumers, because what will happen, the consumers do have that choice that they can easily shift to coffee. Imagine the prices of tea taking a marginal jump. So what will happen, the people they would certainly start moving towards the other you could say available substitutes, which can be any other beverage, for example your coffee. So in that case what will happen, the producers will not be easily able to shift the entire burden of taxes onto the consumers, because the consumers have an option to switch to coffee. But if the taxes are imposed on both sort of your goods, let's suppose this coffee and your tea, then what will happen? Then it will be very difficult for consumers to somehow escape this liability, because now that coverage of tax is wider, that neither you can escape the tea or the taxes that is imposed onto the coffee. So when we are talking about the tax elasticity, we consider into mind that what is the coverage, that entire coverage of the taxes. Are they being imposed onto one good? Are there any substitutes available? Or the taxes being imposed onto both sort of your goods. So that makes it a little difficult for the consumer when the tax coverage is wider. That means if the tax is being imposed onto tea and coffee on a similar manner. So in that case the consumers will not be able to shed off the burden, they cannot shift the duty, or the producers have the greater, you could say, margin to push on the taxes to the consumers. So that means we talk about that how the coverage of the taxes, if they being wider in its very form, they can certainly impact the consumers in a greater manner. And in case the coverage is narrower, for example we are just levying the taxes on one of the product but not onto its substitute, then in that case it is little difficult to shift on the burden of taxes onto the consumers. Similarly, we have been talking about that, the taxes being elastic in nature or inelastic in nature, and their impact onto the either the consumers or to the suppliers. Now, we have already discussed that how the coverage of the taxes, can be one factor bringing a change into the same. The second thing is your time period. Now, when we talk about time period, it can be either a short run time period or it can be a long run time period. So, when we talk it first from the supply side of point of view, that what will happen to the tax elasticity and when it being imposed in the short run in the supply side. So, talking from the perspective of your supply side, in a short run, it will be really very difficult for the producers that they shift on this burden to consumers, because the supply is inelastic because of the fixed cost of production. And when it comes to, as compared to the long run supply, it is, long run supply happens to be very elastic. Therefore, they can easily shift on the burden of commodity taxes to the consumer. But when talking about from the perspective of a short run, it will be very difficult for them that, they shift on the entire burden of taxes to the consumers. So, that ways time period does have a, relevance in deciding upon the burden of taxation. So, in supply side, we are categorically talking about short run and long run. Short run, it becomes difficult to pass on the burden to consumers, reason being the supply will become inelastic, or supply is comparatively less elastic because of its, fixed cost of productions. And when we talk about the second factor, that is your long run supply, it comparatively is more elastic. Therefore, the burden of your commodity taxes, they can be easily be, or you can say comparatively be easier to shift on to the consumers. Similarly, we'll be talking about how the time period will have a say in case of your demand sides, right? Now, demand side means consumer, thinking it from the perspective of a consumer. So, let's suppose if a commodity is taxed and it may have to be purchased in a short run, and in short run there may be absence of any substitutes that are available for the same. So, that means what? You are buying a good and there being a demand for the same, and because the good is such that it has its own niche market, and for a consumer, or let's suppose as a consumer, you find it little difficult to find a substitute of the same. Therefore, the consumers are not in a better position to avoid such taxes. But comparatively in a long run, when various brands are also pushing for entering into that particular market segment, right? So then the consumer is having the larger choices to make. So the consumer will be in a better position to avoid the taxes in the long run. So again, if we categorically divide into two perspectives, one, we talked about the supply side, and within supply we talk about the short run and the long run. And in the short run, we talk about that it is very difficult for the suppliers to shift on the burden of taxation to consumers, and in the long run, from the supply point of view, it becomes a little easier to push on the burden to the consumers of the taxes. Similarly, the second aspect that we take upon is your demand side, and within demand side we again categorically divide it into two perspectives, short run and the long run. And within that short run we talk about, because there being no substitutes available for the product, so what will happen, the consumer will not be having much choices, right? So he is not left out with the option. Let's suppose if a commodity A and its price A is there and its price has increased, so does the taxes have increased, and due to which there being a rise into the price. So let's suppose a consumer is not having any alternative to product A. So in that case, the consumer will be left with no choice but have to pay the higher amount of taxes. So that is what we say, that in a short run we are not left with much of choices, and therefore they have to bear the burden of taxation. And when compared to the second perspective, that is in the long run, where we believe if substitutes, many other firm starts entering into the market and there being substitutes of product A in the form of product B and C, then what will happen? The consumer will be having a wider choice to make, right? He can either choose A or B or C. So now the consumers are in a better position that they can, avoid the taxes which are there in the form of higher prices in the long run, because if product A increases its price, so you will definitely move to product B or product C or brand B or brand C, right? So that ways, the time period, it really matters a lot when deciding upon that, to which side the burden of taxation will be creating a greater impact. Now, as we have been talking about taxation and its elasticity, we have to also talk about taxation and efficiency. We cannot just levy higher amount of taxes so as to generate additional revenues, because there has to be a upper threshold of the same as defined in the Laffer's curve, right? So there has to be some efficiency, or there has to be some element or borderline to the same. So we'll be talking about the taxation and its efficiency. In a format, we'll talk about that what will be the excess burden of taxation. If we'll keep on increasing the taxes, what will happen? It will lead to excess burden onto the consumer, and see, it's a multiplier effect. If taxes being increased, there will be a direct impact onto the rise of the prices of the product, due to which there will be an excess burden to whom? The consumer. Now, that excess burden onto the consumer will lead to what? There will be reduction in consumers' welfare, right? Because a greater share of his income is moving towards the tax payments. So definitely there will be a reduction into consumers' you could say welfare. Now, they can be illustrated as two major effects. One is your income effect and another one is your substitution effect. Now, when we say upon income effect, we say that, because there being a greater number of taxes being imposed onto the same, so we see reduction in spending power due to imposition of taxes. Now, reduction in spending power means what? आपके पास इनकम तो लिमिटेड है, राइट? कंज्यूमर के पास इनकम लिमिटेड है. अगर गुड्स के प्राइसेस इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं because of a corresponding increase in taxes, what will happen? A greater share of the consumer income will move towards the this additional burden. So there will be reduction in spending power because a greater impact or imposition of the taxes. So that is considered as to be your income effect. Second is your substitution effect, which we say that changes in relative prices induce individuals to substitute one commodity for another. It results in economic inefficiency by interfering with consumer choices. Now, when we say that there are being changes into relative prices, so that means कि they can, agar if you will increase the amount of commodity A, so it will also lead to a substitution effect, that the consumer will avoid this product A because of the rise in the prices, and that rise in prices is because of the rise in taxes, right? So they will move to the second commodity, right? So that will lead to what? That will bring the economic inefficiency, because then we are doing what? We are interfering somehow with the consumer choices in a manner that, if let's suppose we are increasing the price of product A, the consumer will do what? That he'll shift to product B, or he'll stop consuming product A, because he has his limited income. He cannot spend a greater share of income towards the taxes or towards the, expenses. So that is the another impact, that because of the excess burden of taxation, it will have double impact, one onto the income and the another onto the substitution. Now, since the elasticity of demand for various goods, be it your A, B, C, whatever type of your goods, it is different. Therefore, it requires different taxes on these goods. So we say goods with relatively inelastic demand, जिसका demand change नहीं हो रहा, inelastic है ना, they would be taxed at a higher rate as compared to the goods with the elastic demand. मतलब क्या हुआ इस केस में? जब जिन goods का जो डिमांड है वो रिलेटिवली inelastic है, right? So goods with relatively inelastic demand would be taxed at a higher rate than the goods with the elastic demand. तो जिन goods का जो you could say demand change नहीं हो रहा है, तो वहां पर ज्यादा चॉइस है आपके ऊपर पास कि आप उनको हायर अमाउंट पे टैक्स कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि कंज्यूमर का डिमांड तो चेंज नहीं हो रहा है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल एनी सिन गुड्स, राइट? सो सिन गुड्स के केस में क्या होगा, कंज्यूमर का डिमांड आपका स्टेबलाइज है, वो चेंज नहीं हो रहा है, वो उतना ही है. तो आपके पास हायर लिबर्टी है दैट यू कैन impose the greater amount of taxes onto the same, right, as compared to the goods with elastic demand. तो जहां elastic demand की बात कर रहे हैं, यानी कि कंज्यूमर वहां अपनी you could say demand for the good change कर सकता है, because उसके पास alternatives available है, right? So that ways we can say that goods which are having inelastic demand, they'll be taxed at a higher rate as compared to the goods which are having a elastic demand. Now next is your administrative cost. So that means a cost which is incurred by the authorities in administering the taxes. So we talk about this thing that the in the previous segments, that we talk about the Musgravian's point of view, wherein we talk about the amount of cost that we are putting up to administrate the taxes, they should not be much higher. अगर आप wages, expenses या salaries पर या पूरा infra या machinery को setup करने के लिए ज़्यादा amount engage कर रहे हैं या cost engage कर रहे हैं, so इतना tax revenue नहीं हो रहा कि जितना हम उसको administer करने के लिए cost put up कर रहे हैं. So that will obviously violate the principle of economy. Therefore, this principle says that to the level possible, right, we should try to make sure that this cost of administration, this should be the least, right, so that the your consumers, right, when we are levying the taxes to them for the machinery, for the administration, it should not become a very cost expensive affair, or it should not violate the very basic principle of economy, right? Next is your compliance cost. So when we are talking about this compliance cost, that means costs incurred by the taxpayers or the third parties in complying with tax over and above the main payment made to authorities. It can be money cost, time cost, psychic cost. So basically your administrative and compliance cost, they sum up to the total operational cost. So now compliance cost का मतलब क्या हुआ है? We will say कि एक taxes burden को, let's suppose any responding to any notices, responding to any queries, responding to any, let's suppose filing the return well in time. So all these things are somehow related to the money cost that is indulged with the primary fact as the primary factor. Second is your time cost, because we'll be engaging a lot of time to comply with the taxes, right? Similarly, it also puts a hit to your mental or psychological thing, right? So compliance cost is basically which has been incurred by your taxpayers so as to comply with the taxes, and taxes can be in the form of your fines, commission, penalties, your main return, your scrutiny, any notices received, any assessment going up for the same. So basically these two are the factors that sums up to the total operational cost for the taxation. And the main funda when we are discussing about the taxation and efficiency, we talk about that so as to bring this efficiency, the administrative and compliance cost to the level possible, they should be the least, right? They should not be much. So that is why we talk about that the entire fundamental of imposing the taxes should not be to violate the basic principles of a good taxation structure. Rather, it should be such that goes or abide by your full, any you could say taxation structure major characteristics, be it we reflect to canon of economy or we reflect to any other important criterion with respect to your taxation. So that is why in order to bring the tax efficiency, it is very much crucial that all the costs are very effectively and efficiently being handled, right. Now, next is we say that high degree of your responsiveness of a tax yield to changes in tax income or national income is a desirable characteristics of any tax system. That means what? कि जितना ज़्यादा जो आपका responsiveness हो रहा है, taxes revenues आपने generate हो रहे हैं, उसका relationship आपकी national income के साथ, that's one of the major characteristics of any tax system. Because every government, they depends on to the tax revenue so as to finance the larger part of its expenditure, and therefore it is very necessary that there being an increasing proportion of your national income that flows into this public treasury as taxes. That means जितना आपका एक automatic changes कहते हैं जिसे हम, that means we are not increasing the tax rates, we are not doing any other changes into the taxation structure, but because of the automatic changes, it is automatically generating a greater proportion of national income towards the taxes. So that is what we called as responsiveness of tax yield to the changes in the national income, and which is very must for any economy. Because you imagine if a greater revenue of the taxes are moving towards the national treasury, so what will happen? The government will be receiving more of the tax revenues, they will be utilizing it towards the welfare of the state, to the for the economic growth, for the infrastructure development, so as to disperse many welfare schemes towards the government, so towards the consumers, right. So that is what is the major benefit of having a greater degree of responsiveness of tax yield to changes in national income, right. Now, the main intent is to basically increase the incremental tax ratio, and by incremental tax ratio we means a tax system in which the percentage of taxes as a person pays, it increases based on their income level. So in an incremental tax system, those which are having the higher income, they pay a larger portion of the taxes, and therefore they will contribute more to the government revenue than those with lower income. Now, what do we mean by incremental? Because right now I have stated a definition to you which talks about this incremental tax ratio, and which basically talks about that the percentage of taxes that we pay to the government, it increases based on our income level. So if in an incremental tax system what will happen, जिनका ज़्यादा income होगा एक income brackets के हिसाब से या income slabs के हिसाब से, they will pay a larger proportion of their taxes to the government, and they will be better able, or let's suppose they will be able to contribute more to the government revenue as compared to those which are having a lower share of income, right. So this is what we refer to, that there being incremental rise into the taxes of the government, and that incremental rises because of the automatic responses in the system. तो ऑटोमेटिक रिस्पॉन्स कैसे हुआ कि लोगों की इनकम अगर बढ़ रही है, राइट, सो वो उतना इंक्रीज टैक्सेस भी गवर्नमेंट को पे करेंगे. लेट्स सपोज कि गवर्नमेंट ने कोई भी न्यू टैक्सेस इम्पोज नहीं करे हैं, या गवर्नमेंट ने कोई भी टैक्स रेट्स में चेंजेस नहीं करे हैं, राइट. सो अगर उसके बिना भी डिस्पाइट दैट फैक्टर हमारे टैक्सेस अगर इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं, so that is incremental taxes. That means because of the better capacity of the people, and that is attributed towards their you could say that they are earning more onto the income levels. So because they are earning more, they are having the higher incomes, so that is why they are paying a larger portion of the taxes. So with the improved standard of living, with the improved you could say income levels, that will lead to more and more rise into the revenue for the government, and that is what we say, that this entire thing with the incremental rise into the taxes, it will increase the incremental tax ratio, which is nothing but a factor to the national income, and which indicates the growth, which indicates the sustainability, and which indicates that okay, greater revenues are moving towards the public treasury, right, or the government treasury, and which is used to you could say disburse various funds to the people, or to implement various schemes, right. So basically we are right now talking about the automatic changes that leads to your rise into incremental taxes, right. So we'll be talking about the discretionary changes, the buoyancy of taxes. So we'll be talking about these things in the coming segment. So for the time, thank you.